So in today's talk, which as you all know is about happiness and daily living for the human being, happiness specifically means not pleasure, not a happiness from feeling good because of something that is happening, not excitement or joy or pleasure because you're with friends you like, or you're watching a good movie, or you're out in the garden enjoying the nice weather. All of that's pleasure. And we associate the word happiness with feeling good. And in fact, happiness for the human being is never going to be found in feeling good all of the time, because of the simple fact that life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, meaning circumstance is not always going to be in line with our preferences. And it doesn't make sense to feel good when something that doesn't feel good is happening. And that's got nothing to do with your attitude. What that is pointing at is very much that the body has its biological preferences, and those preferences are either met or not met in the flow of life. And so if they're not met, that means a feeling of not pleasure. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to feel completely lost and uncomfortable about that. It simply means that it's not in line with our preferences, so we don't feel like, yes, that is fantastic. It wouldn't make sense to feel, yes, that is fantastic. Take a simple example that you want to have a warm shower, and you get in the shower and the water's cold and it doesn't heat up, and you have to have a shower because you've got to go out, let's say, and you haven't had a shower for a day or two, and you can't go out without it, so you decide, okay, cold water shower. Now, it doesn't make sense that you're going to be excited about that while it's happening. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't have to turn into suffering, it just isn't pleasurable. So that happiness through life being a good feeling all the time, meaning circumstances working out the way that suit your preferences all the time, just isn't going to happen. And so happiness in the form of pleasure isn't what's available in life. And that's not only because life is never going to be pleasure. Even if life was pleasure, we would still find that that is not the happiness that we are seeking. It won't deliver what we think it might deliver when we don't have pleasure. And if we did get it, we'd find actually that's not satisfying. So the happiness that I'm speaking about is a happiness not delivered by circumstance, not delivered by pleasure, but rather a happiness that is more accurately described as peace of mind. And peace of mind is always found in our attitude to circumstance. And the opposite of peace of mind is suffering. And peace of mind is really when the suffering dissipates. So you could sort of look at suffering as a storm being there, and peace of mind being the dissolution of the storm. It actually may not be a good analogy, because someone might imagine the ending of the storm clouds and the shining through of sunshine and nice weather. So actually, let's say that's a bad analogy, because it sort of implies pain, the storm, and pleasure, nice sunlight. What I was getting at is that peace of mind is really the absence of something, the falling away of something. And what's left in its place is actually the absence of the suffering, the uncomfortableness. So a better analogy, although don't confuse, because the analogy is talking about pleasure and pain, so don't confuse that aspect of the analogy. A better analogy might be if you have a headache And good health, let's say, is the absence of the headache. It isn't the gaining of positive health. Positive health is just the absence of bad health. And in a way, peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And so it's very plain and ordinary. It doesn't stand out and grab your attention unless you become very familiar with what the alternative is, which is suffering. And then when we've our attention has landed on suffering, knowing that it is not circumstantial, that suffering is always one's attitude to the circumstance. And so when our attention has landed on this and recognized that it is attitude to circumstance, and that the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. And after having felt that and being aware of it and seeing how it pervades the daily life experience, moment after moment after moment, and how it colors it in a way that we would say is uncomfortable with oneself, then when it's absent, when it's not there, when that falls away, that's when we can appreciate the simple absence of suffering, which is really on one hand very ordinary, not much to write home about. But if you are able to juxtapose it, to compare it, to contrast it to the presence of suffering, if we find that that peace of mind is there on a continuous, unbroken basis, such that it allows us to go through the day feeling like there's no problem, feeling like we're quite, at least we're not unhappy to be alive, we're not unhappy to be in a certain circumstance, we're not feeling resentful to the other, looking back in the past with regret, looking into the future with anxiety or expectation. When that's there on a continuous, unbroken basis, and we understand what the alternative could be, that's when we realize what a gift it is. And so in today's satsang, I'd like to talk about the difference between biological reactions and psychological reactions. The word psychological reaction is specifically kept for those movements of the thinking mind. And the movements of the thinking mind are those movements based on the deeply ingrained beliefs or conditioning that set in place the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So whenever that kicks in, looking at the past, looking at the future, looking at the present moment, with an attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes, that is the thinking mind, and it is suffering. The thinking mind manifests as guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And we can refer to that as psychological reactions, an attitude towards the flow of life, which is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, that claims ownership over that and says it shouldn't be this way, I shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have done that, I wonder what's going to happen in the future. And that is the uncomfortableness. The biological reactions are the movements as part of the circumstance, the movements that happen in circumstance, that are not one's attitude to circumstance, right? Not the attitude of attachment or doership that is looking into the past and looking into the future and complaining about the present. It is just the simple opening of the fridge door, answering a question when someone asks you a question, doing your shopping, driving in the car, seeing nature, watching a movie, having an argument with someone, having fun with people. it's your biological feelings of tiredness, of excitement, of irritation, all sorts. It's the biological reactions of physical pain, all of the sensations that we pick up, and the thinking, which is the working mind thinking, which might say, oh, that's an interesting bird that I haven't seen before. Anything that is about the circumstance, if you were to see a dog come running up to you while you're out walking, and you don't know whether this dog is running up to you because it's aggressive or whatever, and fear arises, that's a biological reaction. It's part of the circumstance. Now, some of these biological reactions are often misinterpreted and assumed to be psychological reactions. And it's very important to get that straight, so that a lot of the biological reactions that are painful can be seen, can be related to as part of the flow of life. And I guess the biological reaction that most people have an issue with is sadness. And in sadness, we might be able to wrap up moods, let's say bad moods. So let's put that as a separate category: sadness, bad moods, and anger. And the reason that they get confused as not being biological reactions and assumed to be psychological reactions is because of a deeply ingrained attachment to outcome, which really means I believe that life will be worthwhile or life will be okay when life is pleasure, 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 pleasure. And because that's in place, we automatically will resist, we automatically do resist pain, and that resistance of pain, not the biological resistance. So if someone was putting something hot on your hand, then there will be a biological resistance and moving away from that. Now, that's not a psychological attachment to pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That's a biological intelligence that moves the hand away from pain. And the body is always going to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And that doesn't denote attachment to outcomes. That is part of the biological preferences of the body that will naturally move towards pleasure and away from pain. However, the biological preferences and the working mind as part of that biological set of movements won't insist psychologically that its preference be delivered. It will move towards it. It will, if there's a chocolate being handed round on a plate, and if it's your preference, your biological preference, the hand will reach out for the chocolate as opposed to the carrot sticks, let's say, if that's not your preference. So the body will move towards pleasure and away from what is less pleasurable, or in fact, if something is painful, naturally the body will move away from that. And that doesn't denote attachment to outcome. That's the biological preferences. Attachment to outcome is the psychological story or the psychological narrative that says my completeness, my happiness is dependent on the pleasure that I prefer being delivered. And when it's not delivered, the psychological thinking mind goes into blame or shame, complaints. So let's say I'm about to take the chocolate and someone else gets there first and takes the last chocolate. Biological preference or the biological reaction might feel the pain of not having one's preference met, but won't turn it into a story of guilt and blame. Oh, I should have been quicker. I shouldn't have paused. I hate them for being rude and sneaking in, pushing in and getting the last one. All of that's the psychological attachment to outcome. And the biological reaction, the working mind, won't create that story, even though the biological reaction is going to move towards pleasure if it can get it. Now, because we have this deeply ingrained attachment to outcomes, when anger arises, or sadness arises, or bad moods arise, they're not pleasurable. There is an inherent, what you could say, pain in the anger. The anger itself doesn't feel good. The fact that others might get offended or hurt or aggressive because you're angry means pain in a feedback loop. And so what we end up forming is a psychological attachment to anger not being there, to sadness not being there. And so when anger arises, the resistance to it comes up. And so the anger is not pure anger, it's anger plus the psychological reaction. And they mix, and they don't feel like two. It just feels like anger is suffering. And it's important for us to understand that the biological anger, the biological sadness, the biological irritation is a biological reaction. And it's important for us to understand that, because that's when we might see our psychological attachment arising simultaneously to the biological reaction of anger, for example. And unless it's described this way, we might just keep insisting and keep feeling, because we haven't seen the subtleties, that anger is suffering. And what also makes it difficult is that when we look at what anger looks like when it arises, it appears like it is blame. And on the surface, someone would say, it doesn't only appear it is blame, it is blame. You're saying, why did you do this? And so you think the understanding of non-doership should prevent a reaction that says, why did you do this? We'd say, well, the understanding of non-doership would mean that you know that this happened because it was destiny, and that the other isn't the doer, but rather an instrument through which life is functioning. And it happened, and they did it because it was my destiny to receive the effect or the result of them functioning the way they functioned. So someone might look in and say, if the understanding of non-doership is total, it doesn't make sense that anger would arise. Now, that's not entirely accurate. Anger won't arise for some people because it's not their temperament to get angry. And even those people whose temperament it is to get angry won't get angry all of the time. But Ramesh, for example, would use the example of being irritable and angry with his house staff when they would do things repeatedly that he had told them not to do. So he said he always liked to have a beer in the fridge, so that in the afternoon, if he felt like a beer, he could have a cold beer. And very often, his attendant wouldn't put the beer in the fridge. And so he'd get angry at the attendant for not putting the beer in the fridge. Now we might think, as we're looking in, wow, he's very attached to the pleasure of having a beer. Whereas the explanation, more accurately, is there is a biological preference for a cold beer in the afternoon. And so when the fridge is open and there's no beer in there, it's not in line with the biological preference. And so there is a biological reaction, which is the one biological reaction would be to clap and to be excited. But that makes sense when something is in line with your preferences. Now, we don't have an issue with excitement, which is a biological reaction. So if a sage gets given a present and they open up the present and they like it and they go, oh, this is wonderful. This is, I've been looking at one of these that my neighbor's been using, and here it is. You got it for me as a present. That's very kind. I appreciate it, and I'm very pleased that I now have one of these. So that sort of reaction, no one would have any issue with, because it's not painful. It's pleasurable. It's making the person that gave the present feel good. It's clear that the receiver of the present is feeling pleased. So we don't question it. You see, that's a biological reaction that makes sense as a result of the circumstance. So if we were to look at anger, which is, as I'm suggesting it, a biological reaction based on the circumstance, if we think the anger shouldn't be there, then the equivalent is for there to be no excitement. So the sage would therefore be relegated to an experience of life and a way of functioning in life that is completely equanimitous on the level of biological reactions. Which means, if someone bought them the present, it's like open up the present and absolutely no response of pleasure. In the same way, no response of pain. Now that just doesn't make sense. So what's this question of equanimity? Equanimity is on the level of our peace of mind. And our peace of mind is not about being Zen on the outside, on the external. It's about having a genuine equanimity and peace with however we react on a biological level. Which means anger can arise, and if it is pure anger without the psychological attachment to anger not being there, which may be the anger arises and then we blame the other on top of the anger, because in a way, like the anger, when we say, why did you do this? That actually isn't blame. Well, it depends on how it arises in the person. In someone where the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has fallen away, we could lose our temper and say, why did you do this? And it doesn't have the bitterness and the uncomfortableness of blame and doership in it. It is the biological reaction. And then after that biological reaction, which is vertical in time, there's no horizontal story that goes along with it if the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has fallen away. So as soon as the biological reaction is over, there is a moving on, essentially, where it is understood that that was the biological reaction in the moment. It wasn't pleasurable for myself, and we understand it might not be, or probably wasn't, pleasurable for the other. But we move on. That doesn't mean you can't apologize. You can apologize for the anger, but no shame, no guilt. understanding that that was part of the flow of life. If, however, we have an attachment to outcome, we assume that happiness is going to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. That's what attachment to outcomes really means. And it assumes that my completeness will be there when there is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so as soon as anger arises, we're in psychological resistance to it, because that is seen and believed to be an attack on my completeness. And so when that happens, the psychological uncomfortableness wraps itself around the anger, and what we feel is this uncomfortableness with ourselves. And that's why it can be so confusing when we hear anger is a biological reaction. I have to say that if I look back on my process, that was the last disagreement or unresolved part of the teaching that I had to move through with Ramesh. I simply couldn't run with the notion that anger and sadness were biological reactions. And why was that? Because I was very familiar feeling and had the concept that suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself. And I remember saying, that is such a great word, uncomfortableness. Suffering is an uncomfortableness. And I generally didn't have much suffering. However, when anger arose from time to time, that's when I'd go, oh, there's that uncomfortableness. So based on my own experience, there was an uncomfortableness when anger arose. And so that fit the label of suffering. So when Ramesh would say, anger is a biological reaction, not a psychological reaction. Anger is a biological reaction, not suffering. I'd say, but Ramesh, whenever I get angry, it feels uncomfortable. So I can't run with this notion that it's a biological reaction and not a psychological reaction. And he'd repeat it. Roger, anger is a biological reaction, not a psychological reaction. And luckily by that stage, I had sort of butted up against certain concepts in the teachings 4 or 5 times before, convinced that they needed to be rejigged because they weren't quite right. Primarily because I didn't understand them. I didn't, things weren't aligned at that stage when I had an issue with each of these concepts. And inevitably, after wrestling with it for whatever time was destined, at some point it would click and I would see what I was not seeing correctly or not feeling correctly or mixing things up. And that's when I realized, he's right and I was wrong. The teaching actually doesn't need to be changed in that regard like I thought it did. In fact, the way it is worded is perfect, and I thought there was a better way only because I wasn't clear. I wasn't clear for myself what components made up what and how they interrelated and where the boundaries of each component was. And when that became clear, I realized, that's... So by this stage, I had enough experience, I guess, to, in the back of my mind, say, even though you think it's not right, it's probably right. And sure enough, at some point, it became clear. Anger is a biological reaction and not a psychological reaction. And why did it become clear? It became clear because at some point, after thinking about what he said, where he kept repeating, Roger, it's a biological reaction, it occurred to me, what if he's right? And what if, whenever anger arises, simultaneous to the anger, there is a psychological resistance to anger happening in me? And that psychological resistance is not seen as being a separate layer of attitude towards the anger And so then it feels like the anger itself is uncomfortableness. And when this possibility opened up to me, it created a scenario where, if this is the case, then he's right. And shortly after, within the next 2 weeks, there was an opportunity where anger arose. And this time, because something must have changed in the system because of that insight, anger arose and there was no uncomfortableness in it. And that was because my working mind had clicked that enlightenment is not the end of anger. Anger will continue to be there from time to time according to one's temperament. And if I have an idea that that enlightenment is the end of anger, then whenever anger arises, I'm bound to feel like, obviously there's more work to be done. As soon as that notion that enlightenment is the end of anger falls away, then anger can arise freely as a biological reaction, I found out, and the attitude of attachment or guilt falls away. And so I laughed quite loudly that when I experienced anger for the first time without an uncomfortableness, and it was in that moment that I realized anger is a biological reaction and not a psychological reaction. But our attachment to pleasure assumes that happiness is going to be found, and also then assumes that enlightenment is the end of our unhappiness, which we think is pain, until it becomes very clear that our unhappiness is our attitude to the pain. Now, all of this that is being said about the biological reaction, so we're creating a distinction between the biological reaction and then the guilt and shame, let's say, towards getting angry, the regret, the continually thinking about how I overreacted, maybe how easily I can lose my temper, how I hurt someone, or how someone doesn't want to be my friend anymore because this is the way that I am. And that thinking can stretch horizontally in time, where we just sort of feel bad about things that have happened. We feel bad about ourselves. We don't feel adequate. And that's the involvement in the anger. That's the suffering. Now, if that happens, so we've created a distinction between the biological reaction, which includes all sorts of biological reactions, including the working mind, including speaking. Speaking is a biological reaction. The movement of the hands is a biological reaction. Drinking, walking, having a shower, eating, the heart pumping is a biological reaction. So there's many different types of biological reaction. Some of them are very automatic. Some of them seem to be much more conscious rather than automatic and unconscious. So everything that is not a psychological reaction of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation is a biological reaction. And then there is the psychological reaction, which is the attitude to those biological reactions. However, even though we've created a distinction, both of them are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. The psychological reaction to do with the up-to-date conditioning specifically of the sort that says, I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so both the biological and the psychological are not my doing. They're just a happening based on the circumstance and the body, mind, organism's particular makeup in that moment. And so there is at first a biological reaction and then a psychological reaction if the doership and attachment is in place. So even if the suffering arises, that too is not your doing. And so in the same way as maybe at some point, if the um, psychological me structure changes, there could be no involvement, no suffering with the circumstance, including with the biological anger. Just like that might happen one day, maybe we might find no involvement in the suffering if the suffering happens. So if we get angry and then we feel guilt about having got angry, and we see that the anger is a biological reaction, the guilt is a psychological reaction, and then we might feel guilty about feeling guilty. But if we realize, if it becomes clear that the guilt is also not my doing, then there can be a falling away of feeling guilty about being guilty, which really means non-involvement with the primary suffering. So we have the pleasure or pain in the moment, and in this case I'm emphasizing that anger, just like laughing, is a biological reaction in the moment. So you might start laughing in a meditation class or in church, which may be inappropriate, let's say. It's a biological reaction. Okay, then we might feel embarrassed or guilty, shame. That is the primary involvement in the biological reaction. Even that, not our doing. We might then feel a secondary involvement, which is secondary suffering, towards the primary suffering, which is involvement in the primary pleasure or pain of the circumstance. And so it's always about the attitude of non-doership kicking in, which means the primary circumstance is not your doing. So the laughing happened, and it may be inappropriate that the laughing happened in a certain environment, but it happened. And it can just stop there. But if we're designed in such a way that we're going to feel guilty, then that's going to be the primary suffering. We might then feel guilty about feeling guilty. That's the secondary involvement. And at any point, they can start falling away. So I think that's we've done that topic to its extreme today, but we'll open up for questions, and we won't go all the way. We'll have half an hour of questions and see what we have. Hello.
Hello, Roger. Thank you so much. This is pure gold, your words, because this idea with sadness and guilt, this was just so strong in my background. And I have to listen again to this satsang, but it makes total sense. And it's just a release. It's so much openness and light in all of this. It's wonderful.
Yeah. No, who says you have to be a certain way?
The echoes of the past, I believe to be my authority, or I really believed people too much, but I couldn't help it because I didn't know any better.
Sure.
But
yes,
anyway, old childhood shit or something, if you would like to use this word. So the point of my freedom, of my peace, is to go to the root of the I feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just getting distracted from getting to the root because I'm still entangled in my suffering.
Well, don't worry. There isn't a Holger that's doing the entanglement in the suffering. So just be the one that sees the entanglement if there is entanglement. So yeah, what I'm saying is there isn't Holger, a doer, doing the entanglement. There might be entanglement, but just see, yes, there's entanglement, and it's part of the divine play of Holger. And if you can find yourself in that perspective, then the one that is looking at the entanglement is free, because The one saying, yes, that is the divine play of entanglement, is not lost in feeling like, oh, I am entangled, I shouldn't be entangled, why is life entangling me, why haven't I figured it out? The that which is aware of the entanglement and not really interested. It's like, yeah, who cares?
High five. Wonderful.
Yeah,
Um,
wonderful. Yeah.
Still a tricky part in this, since we are here bottom up. I mean, so I still have some so-called physical parents, but um, there is still this like an impulse, but maybe that's just a habit, or like an impulse to create some harmony, or to connect, to reconnect, to just to acknowledge and enjoy being human and forget about the past, and to have some to grow up a little bit. Is this something selfish, or is this just some
I think it's nice to have that as an ideal, let's say, or knowing that that is possible, but without being attached to it. Um, so you can, like by discerning, you can discern something. Like you can say, I'm a bit, I'm a bit childish when it comes to such and such. That's a discernment. It doesn't have to turn into a judgment. Often what will happen is we'll say, we'll notice that we can be a bit childish about something. And then when we notice it, we go into a sort of sense of shame over it. And so the difference between discernment and judgment is where we see something and we call it out. We call a spade, right? It's like we can say, that wasn't very intelligent of me. That was, I could have done that better, let's say. Not talking about I could have in, well, let's leave I could have out of it, but you do something and you see the outcome and you realize that was not the smartest way of approaching the situation. And the discernment of it acknowledges that wasn't the smartest way of approaching the situation. The sense of self, the me doer, as soon as it discerns something that is not optimal, it goes into shame about it. I said, you don't need to go into shame. You just call it out what it is, and understand that that was because essentially life has created us to be like that. Um, so if you see that there is something that is not optimal or not ideal, it's good to call it out, but without making it personal and without being attached to it changing.
so then even having seemingly noble intentions can be a source of suffering?
Yes, it can, indeed, because you can have a noble intention, but it can be attachment. So you can want to save the world, for example. Now, it's end world poverty. It can seem like a noble intention, but if the attitude to it is life shouldn't be like this and I have to succeed, then that, unfortunately, noble as it may seem, is your own suffering.
Sometimes I'm in a kind of a interesting place where I just feel everything is perfect, even in the misery and in the disharmony.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I just
But
accept this feeling.
yeah, I think if you're saying it feels perfect even with the disharmony, that is acceptance, which really is, you don't do acceptance, right? In those moments, you just find the non-acceptance is not there. That's acceptance. Acceptance is when non-acceptance is not there.
You could call this grace. you could call this grace. I mean, a gift of life, just the freedom, the joy, just to be, just to breathe, just to be in this moment and not entangled in the past. Or isn't this amazing? I mean, isn't this a joke? What we are doing here on this planet with our being separate selves? What a stupid thing on one level, but how that maybe it's part of this whole thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't discover the beauty and generosity of life.
Yeah, I see it that we have evolved into our current state, and so that means this is a phase of humanness, where, you know, we've managed to figure out a lot of stuff, and yet when we look at our psychological self, there's still plenty of room for improvement, and evolution is very linked to time, and so I think in time, the psychological self will fall away in humans, and talks, books, movies that bring light onto the topic are part of the process of evolution. And so, you know, we can look at it and laugh and think, what a, you know, what a waste of time, for example. But there isn't anyone that could be other than the way they are. Because let's say if someone is in a way wasting time because of, you know, spending all their time looking back at the past, they can't be different, because that's how evolution has evolved us. And in the individual sense, for that person, that in that moment is evolution for them. And when it changes, so it can change for anyone at any time, where there's a deep realization, what a waste of time. And with the deep realization, spending such time that way changes, falls away. So when it changes, it's not anyone's doing either. It's just part of evolution for that particular person. And overall, the whole species will evolve, I believe, where the amount of suffering, psychological suffering, will diminish as an average, or get less as an average, as humanity continues to evolve. Because and why I say this is it becomes blatantly obvious to individuals at first, but more and more, that this is a suboptimal way of relating to life, and that there is another way. And so sages, spiritual teachings have been alerting us to this fact for thousands of years, because that is how evolution works. Some people get it and feel compelled to be part of, well, the feeling compelled is part of the evolutionary instinct, I believe, of moving towards a more optimal way of being. And what I mean by optimal means free of the psychological suffering, not necessarily becoming a better person on a practical level, because the end of suffering means acceptance of your imperfection on a practical level. It means acceptance of your getting irritable, let's say, or feeling low or depressed. If there can be an acceptance of that, then we don't need to become perfect people, but we have become a more optimal version for our own. We then say, when we experience life that way, oh, this is more optimal from my experiential point of view. It's more optimal to not suffer.
So if I have this idea, I see now that it's suboptimal. And so my urge to maybe shout things from the rooftops, or maybe promote your teaching or something like that, this is still just a form of ignorance or arrogance.
You'll see that as suboptimal too.
Wow. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Wow.
Yeah.
So I just relax with the
Yeah, I
feeling
don't.
and allow the feeling of gratitude.
Yeah, I very rarely talk to my friends about um, these concepts, because or my family, for example, unless they ask, unless it comes up. Um, I've seen that bringing this topic up is suboptimal. It's it's not a good it's not a good it's like bringing up politics or religion. You just don't do it.
But
Um,
everybody wants to be
at some
happy.
point you realize. At some point you realize that.
But we all want the same. We all want peace of mind in daily living. Or is this just another idea?
It's in a way it's an idea because, in theory, what that concept is saying is that when we really, once we've tried everything, we'll find nothing satisfies except for peace of mind. So it's saying no one is going to be satisfied until they have peace of mind. However, in practice, there are plenty of people that are, in practice, want success. Let's say. So if I'm talking about peace of mind, because in theory it's what everyone wants, in practice it's not what Joe Blow wants. He wants success. Eventually, if he were to live long enough, I would say he will come round to the fact that he doesn't want success really. What he wants is peace of mind. But in that moment, the him wanting peace of mind is just, or happiness wanting, is just theoretical, and so my conversation just isn't going to land. Of course, if someone brings it up, or if people are at satsang, then you know that okay, they're there for that, and so it's appropriate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger.
You're welcome. Hi, Luca.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. So I had an interesting insight where I saw that in my life, that all this is a link to something I think I heard you quote the Buddha, that I saw that all my suffering was linked to desire, not the biological desire like hunger or sex or anything like that, but the psychological desire of I want things to be different, give me something else. And basically the desire was the cause of all my suffering. And that's what I wanted to say, basically.
Indeed, that's a good insight to have. Like if you boil Buddhism down as I came across it, I know this is doing an injustice in a way to Buddhism because it's a vast, vast teaching. But when I came across it, I think just some broad stuff that was very relevant to my seeking jumped out. And one of them is that Buddha says enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is attachment, and the cause of attachment is desire, or the other way around, maybe. The cause of desire is anyway. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. Which one is it? Attachment. Yeah, the cause of enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is,
I think it's attachment. No,
attachment.
no.
So it goes, when we have a belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, we then desire those outcomes. So it's the desire is a craving for what we think we need. It's like a craving for air. And so this desire essentially is what Buddha has put as the root of suffering. So if that desire falls away, then suffering falls away. And it's very important to understand the distinction between desire and preference. So preference is what you're talking about, where you have a preference for food and sex and sleep. Attachment is a psychological craving for it, believing that that is what you need in order to be complete.
Yeah, I think the word uncomfortableness fits in really well. Like, I have this thing where, usually when I'm eating a meal, it's pleasurable, but because the psychological mind kicks in, it's like I don't even enjoy the meal. It's like that you eat the meal to get to the end of the meal because it's always about the next thing. And so I had this experience today where I was eating a meal and I've never enjoyed a meal so much. And it wasn't even like the best meal ever. It was just a meal. But because there wasn't this constantly trying to get to the next thing, every mouthful was really full. And also when there's pain, you also feel the pain more fully as well, but there's no uncomfortableness in the pain. It's just pain.
Yeah, I agree. This is very good. Nice to see.
I also had this little like 2-second flash where I saw that I am everything. It kind of came out of nowhere, and it was like a second. Maybe you have something to say about that. I don't know.
Say it again.
I had this flash where I saw that everything is me.
Everything is you.
Yeah, I'm everything. It was very quick. I don't know. It came out of nowhere.
There's a lot of insights, and the insights feel very absolute often, and actually they're usually an insight from a very specific perspective. So we can open up and have an insight of where there is sort of direct contact with the present moment, and there is absolutely no filter that is normally happening just because of our thinking, of different sorts of thinking, not only suffering, but many other types of very unconscious thinking. But unconscious doesn't mean suffering sorts. It can just be a sense of being a person. And there can be moments where that falls away, and in that moment, the experience is radically different. It feels well, it's different because certain functions are missing, certain functions have fallen away, and so there's a glimpse, you could say, of life known from a different perspective, and to me, it's what those insights are pointing at. So, for example, one of the things that I would suggest is that the falling away of these unconscious levels of thinking are not, as far as I would describe it, not enlightenment. The falling away of the suffering levels is liberation or enlightenment, but we then won't necessarily feel what you've described you having a glimpse of. And then we might, after having that glimpse, we might think, oh, I had this glimpse, and life was so radically different, and it felt so connected and beautiful and profound, that we assume that that's what it's going to be, that one day there will be this continuous life of that. And it's quite seductive. I mean, when you have a glimpse of something that feels amazing, our attachment to outcomes says, oh, that's what it must be. That's what I want it to be. And because it's a glimpse of something I've never really had before, that's what it must be. Because I'm also on a spiritual seeking path, and so this happened, which must mean that's it. And I would say, so I say regularly, I don't think that's it. I think that's a peak experience. And what it's useful at is showing us that there are these layers of the human being that can fall away in that moment of glimpse. They've essentially, some layers have fallen away. Um, and it's not to say, oh, they can fall away and they should fall away. It's actually just to see that there are layers there making up our experience. And seeing the layers making up our experience is insightful. And it's not about them necessarily falling away again and again and again. It's more about what that glimpse showed you. And I guess you have to, because you might not see the fact that it felt that way because certain layers fell away, certain layers of thought, let's say. That's my explanation. So that's what I saw for myself, is that, oh, it starts to show all of the layers that make up the human experience. And the layer that we're talking about as being most important to fall away is the suffering.
The only layer I'm interested in falling away is like what you said, the suffering. I don't really like, I've had a few experiences, like consciousness things, but they never really stuck in my mind. Like I kind of forgot about them.
That's I think that's very nice. Someone mentioned recently love, this feeling of love, unconditional love, towards another person, or even towards another person, but very impersonally, towards all of life, where there is just this
Overflowing of love.
unusual love that arises. And that fits into this sort of category that we're talking about here. Those feelings can definitely happen. And once again, they're gifts when they happen. They're there to be enjoyed. They show us the wonder of all of this. I don't think that is liberation. It might happen more often when someone is free from doership and attachment to outcomes, because doership and attachment to outcomes tends to create the opposite of love. And so, resistance and blame and shame and hatred, seeing the other as a competitor, a rival, someone that can take things away from you. And those things are what you believe to be your completeness. And so there's bound to be more obstacles towards these profound feelings of love. But to assume that if doership and attachment falls away, it would mean a strong feeling of love on a continuous basis, to me is too big a jump. I would say that what it would mean on a continuous basis is peace of mind, the absence of hating the other, the absence of hating oneself, the absence of expectation. And then from time to time, these feelings of love are going to come in. And once again, they're very seductive, because when they come in, they're going to feel more impressive than peace of mind. The thing to realize is that peace of mind is available on a continuous, unbroken basis. These feelings are not, in my opinion. And more importantly, if we got them on a continuous, unbroken basis, which we don't, we tend to get them in bursts. Because it's a feeling, we will normalize to it if it was there all the time. And then if there wasn't peace of mind, we would crave a stronger feeling of love. So the feeling of love arises now and it contrasts our standard feeling, and so it feels great. But it will become the standard at some point if it was there on a continuous, unbroken basis. Now, there's a lot of, people that, I'm not sure about those listening, but in spiritual seeking, there will be lots of people that say, no, it's all about love. And the assumption is a feeling of love, because that's what we're looking for as seekers. We're looking, when there's attachment for outcomes, very few seekers are actually looking for peace of mind. Most seekers are either looking for love or oneness. To me, the implication of love and oneness is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. So in expression, love and oneness equal peace of mind.
Thank you for your answers. Very useful.
Thank you, Luca. I think we'll take one more question. Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for taking these questions. Something that you said today sparked something in me. I have a lot of psychological fear, and I'm wondering if that's the same as the way you're talking about anger and sadness. Something will happen, and I will be fearful about an outcome, right? And I can fully see that this is my investment in outcomes. So I see my resistance to it, like I'm like, oh, this shouldn't be here, sort of like what you were saying. But I'm wondering if you treat that differently. Over. Thank you.
Well, just based on how you describe it, I think that psychological fear is a form of suffering, maybe close to anxiety or worry. And it's more horizontal rather than the biological reactions, which tend to be less horizontal and more part of the circumstance. However, once that's there, if that's there, the psychological fear, our attitude towards it hopefully is exactly the same as our attitude towards biological anger. If I was talking about biological anger before. So it's good to have a distinction of them, as one is biological and the other is psychological fear or a form of suffering. But ultimately, the attitude towards both of them is neither of them, even though they're different, one is biological, the other is psychological, neither of them are my doing. Both of them are happening according to God's will. And so be disinterested in it.
Yeah, I don't know if I just heard it differently today, but it definitely I could see how I was thinking this shouldn't be here, and I'm pretty hopeful in approaching this in the future. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.